Welcome back. Today we follow Darren Caldwell, a billionaire entrepreneur who finally takes a rare break from his high-powered life, flying commercial for the first time in years with his wife Vanessa and their daughter Mia. But their first-class journey takes an unexpected turn when Rachel, a flight attendant with a biased agenda, decides they don't belong in luxury seating. After being repeatedly questioned and ultimately forced to move, Darren plays his next move with quiet precision. But here's the best part. Rachel has no idea who she's dealing with. Darren doesn't just have first-class tickets. He owns the airline. What happens next? A corporate reckoning, a viral scandal, and a lesson in why you should never judge a book by its cover. Get ready for a dramatic power shift, a shocking reveal, and karma served at 30,000 feet. Hit subscribe. More unforgettable stories are on the way. The jet bridge hummed with quiet tension, the rhythmic beeps of scanners blending with the low murmur of first-class passengers boarding the plane. At the front of the line, Darren Caldwell adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy suit, the subtle sheen of his Rolex catching the overhead lights. Beside him, Vanessa, poised in an ivory silk dress, rested a manicured hand on their daughter's shoulder. Mia, 8 years old and full of restless energy, clutched her well-loved teddy bear, her eyes sparkling with excitement. To her, this was just another adventure. To Darren, it was a rare moment of respite, a chance to step away from boardrooms, mergers, and billion-dollar negotiations. They had opted for a commercial flight, a decision Vanessa had insisted on. "Let's do something normal for once," she had teased. Their private jet was grounded for maintenance, and she had convinced him that flying first class like everyone else would be a refreshing change. Darren had agreed, not realizing that the next few hours would test his patience like never before. As they stepped into the plush first-class cabin, the scent of leather seats and expensive cologne hung in the air. Passengers were already settling in, sipping champagne, flipping through newspapers. Everything about this moment should have been effortless, but as Darren guided his family to their seats, a pair of sharp, scrutinizing eyes locked onto them. From across the cabin, Rachel Simmons, a flight attendant with a practiced smile and a clipboard pressed to her chest, stiffened. Her lips tightened, her gaze flickering between them and the seating chart. She didn't need to check the manifest to know what she thought. Something wasn't right. And just like that, the calm before the storm shattered. The moment Darren settled into his seat, he felt it, that almost imperceptible shift in energy, the kind he had learned to recognize in boardrooms and negotiations, a tension lingering in the air, sharp and watchful. Across the cabin, Rachel Simmons stood rigid near the galley, her polished black heels planted as if bracing for battle. She wasn't just observing, she was assessing, scrutinizing, waiting for something, anything, to confirm the doubt that flickered behind her eyes. Darren exhaled slowly, adjusting his seatbelt while Vanessa helped Mia buckle hers. Their daughter, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere, giggled as she squeezed her teddy bear, its soft fur pressing against her cheek. But Vanessa wasn't as distracted. She felt it too, the weight of an unspoken challenge hanging between them and the uniformed woman who now made her way toward them. Rachel's steps were brisk, deliberate. Her forced smile barely masked the sharp edge in her voice as she spoke. "Excuse me, sir. Ma'am, may I see your boarding passes?" Vanessa blinked, caught off guard. "Of course." She reached into her purse, retrieving the sleek black envelope that held their first-class tickets. Rachel took them without a word, her manicured fingers tightening around the cardstock. She studied them longer than necessary, flipping them over as if expecting to find something. Some mistake, some justification. But there was nothing. The names were clear, the seats were correct, the booking was fully confirmed. Still, Rachel hesitated. "I'll just need to verify these with the front desk." Her voice remained clipped, professional, but Darren caught the slight hesitation, the flicker of something unspoken. Vanessa narrowed her eyes, shifting in her seat. "Is there a problem?" Rachel's practiced smile didn't waver. "I just want to make sure everything is in order. Won't take but a moment." A moment. Darren had spent years at the top of the business world. He knew when a moment meant more than it seemed. This wasn't protocol. This was something else. As Rachel turned on her heel and walked away, Vanessa exhaled sharply, gripping the armrest. "That wasn't normal," she murmured. Darren tilted his head slightly, watching as Rachel disappeared behind the curtain. "No," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It wasn't." And as passengers around them shifted, whispering in hushed tones, one thing was clear. This was far from over. Rachel's heels clicked sharply against the polished floor of the galley, each step echoing like a countdown ticking toward disaster. She gripped the in-flight phone, her nails tapping against the plastic as she waited. The distant hum of passengers settling in, the soft clinking of glasses in first class, it all blurred into background noise. Finally, a voice crackled through the receiver. "Gate operations, this is Mark." Rachel lowered her voice, glancing toward the curtain that separated the galley from the cabin. "Hey Mark, I need you to check something for me. I've got a family in first class. Last name Caldwell. Can you confirm their tickets?" There was a pause, followed by the rapid clicking of a keyboard. Rachel held her breath, waiting, hoping that there was some mistake, some administrative error that would justify the gnawing discomfort curling in her chest. Then Mark's voice returned, firm and clear. "The Caldwell family? Their booking was confirmed weeks ago. Paid in full. First-class privileges. Everything checks out. Why?" Rachel's grip on the phone tightened. The answer irritated her more than it relieved her. "No reason," she muttered before hanging up abruptly. She turned, her jaw clenched. She didn't need a system check to tell her something was off. Steeling herself, Rachel strode back toward first class, brushing past her younger colleague, Lisa, who was refilling a tray of drinks. Lisa frowned. "Did they check out?" Rachel hesitated before scoffing. "Look at them," she whispered, nodding toward the Caldwells. "Do they look like our usual first-class passengers?" Lisa's face darkened. "Rachel, you can't say that." Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't reply, but the decision had already been made. She took a slow, measured breath and squared her shoulders. It didn't matter what the reservation system said. It didn't matter that Lisa was watching her with growing unease. She had a job to do. As she re-entered the cabin, Darren was leaning back in his seat, watching her with an unreadable expression. Vanessa's fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, her patience thinning. Mia, still blissfully unaware, traced patterns against the window with her tiny fingers. Rachel swallowed down the flicker of doubt that crept up her spine. "Sir, I need you to come with me," she said, her voice clipped. "There's an issue with your reservation." The murmurs in first class grew louder, heads turning. Darren exhaled, unfolding his hands slowly. The storm was coming, and Rachel had no idea just how much damage it was about to cause. Silence gripped the cabin like a coiled spring, stretched taut, ready to snap. Every eye in first class flicked toward Darren as he slowly rose to his feet. His movements were measured, precise, the kind of practiced control that came from years of knowing his presence alone could shift the energy in any room. Yet in this moment, as he adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate ease, there was something else beneath the surface, a quiet storm brewing. Vanessa sat motionless, her nails pressing into the leather armrest, her gaze locked onto Rachel. Mia, sensing the sudden change in her parents' demeanor, clutched her teddy bear tighter, her tiny fingers curling around the fabric. Rachel cleared her throat, straightening her posture as if doubling down on her authority. "If you'd follow me, sir," she repeated, the edge in her voice sharper now, as though challenging him to resist. Darren didn't. Not yet. He let out a slow breath, adjusting his suit jacket before stepping into the aisle. The weight of a dozen stairs followed him, whispers rippling like an uneasy tide. As he walked past Vanessa, she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Their eyes met, and in that single glance, an entire conversation passed between them. "Be patient, be careful, but don't let this slide." Rachel led him toward the front of the plane, her shoulders squared, but Darren noticed the way her fingers twitched slightly at her side. She wasn't as sure of herself as she wanted to be. They disappeared behind the heavy curtain, entering the galley. The hum of the engines vibrated under their feet as Rachel turned to face him, arms crossed over her crisp uniform. "We need to clarify some details regarding your reservation," she said, her voice steadier now. like she had convinced herself she was in the right. Darren tilted his head slightly, watching her, studying her. He had built his career dismantling people like this, those who mistook their perception of power for actual power. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. One tap, one call. Rachel's posture stiffened. She didn't know it yet, but the moment everything changed had already begun. The phone call was brief, just a few quiet words, spoken with the kind of authority that didn't need to be loud to be heard. Darren ended the call just as quickly as he had made it, slipping his phone back into his pocket with the precision of a man who already knew how this would play out. Rachel, however, was still pretending she had control. She stood rigid, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her polished demeanor barely masking the discomfort now creeping into her eyes. The subtle twitch in her jaw, the slight shift in her stance. Darren noticed it all. Then the intercom chimed. Rachel turned sharply as the captain's voice filled the cabin, steady and composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We have received an urgent update from our executive team. Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell, on behalf of the airline, we sincerely regret any inconvenience caused." Rachel's throat tightened. Executive team? Darren arched a brow, watching as her composure finally cracked. A muscle in her neck twitched, her fingers tightening into a white-knuckled grip at her sides. And then Lisa, the younger flight attendant who had been watching everything unfold, gasped. She had been checking her phone, her face growing paler by the second. Her wide eyes darted toward Darren, then back to the screen. Rachel saw it too. A news alert. The headline spread across the screen like a blade cutting through the last shred of her confidence. Billionaire airline owner and his family face first-class discrimination on their own plane. The color drained from Rachel's face. Lisa swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh my God, Darren Caldwell, you're..." Rachel's breath hitched. Number it couldn't be. Her fingers scrambled for the flight manifest, flipping through pages until she saw it. The designation she had ignored, the one she had been too blinded by bias to recognize. Executive level, primary shareholder. A chill ran down her spine. The man she had just forced out of first class, he didn't just have a seat, he had a stake in the very company she worked for. Slowly, Darren stepped forward, lowering his voice just enough to send a shiver through the air between them. "Now, Rachel," he said, his tone as smooth as steel, "would you like to tell me again why my family doesn't belong in first class?" Rachel had faced difficult passengers before, but never like this. Never a man who could make a single phone call and send an entire corporation into damage control. Never someone who could look at her with such unshakable calm and make her realize, too late, that she had made the biggest mistake of her career. The hum of the aircraft's engines filled the silence between them, but Rachel barely heard it. Her heart pounded, her skin prickling with a cold sweat as Darren's words settled over her, like a final verdict. "Would you like to tell me again why my family doesn't belong in first class?" Rachel's mouth opened, but no words came. The confidence she had worn like armor had cracked, and beneath it was only dread. Then the intercom crackled to life again. This time, it wasn't the captain. "Miss Simmons, please report to the galley immediately." Rachel flinched. The voice belonged to the head of in-flight operations. Darren didn't move. He didn't need to. The damage had already been done, and he knew it. As Rachel turned, every step back toward the galley felt heavier than the last. She could feel the weight of the passengers' stares, the quiet murmurs growing louder. Lisa, still holding her phone, whispered to another attendant, "It's already online. The executive team has been contacted. This is bad." Rachel pushed through the curtain, barely making it into the galley before the phone rang again. She snatched it up with shaking fingers. "This is Simmons." The response was clipped, cold. "Miss Simmons, I'm Captain Reynolds. I just got off the phone with corporate. Upon landing, you are to remain on board for a full debrief with security and our legal team. Do not attempt to leave the aircraft until instructed." Rachel's breath came shallow, panic rising in her chest. "Captain, Save it," he interrupted, his voice like a blade. "Corporate is furious. You have no idea who you just tried to throw off this plane." Rachel clutched the counter for support, her knees weak. Meanwhile, back in first class, Darren sat beside Vanessa, taking a sip of champagne as though nothing had happened. Vanessa leaned in, her voice just a whisper. "Did you plan for this?" Darren smirked, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. "I had a feeling." Rachel sat in the galley, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. The hum of the engines, once a comforting white noise, now felt deafening. Her world had shrunk to this moment, to the sharp, unforgiving reality that she had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Beyond the curtain, first class had returned to a delicate, uneasy normalcy. Passengers sipped their champagne, but the tension lingered, thick as fog after a storm. Conversations were hushed, glances flickered toward the Caldwell family, and phones buzzed with news alerts spreading the story faster than wildfire. Darren leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. He hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't needed to. Vanessa glanced at him, her polished nails drumming against the armrest. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice low but edged with a quiet knowing. Darren exhaled, setting his glass down with deliberate ease. "They'll scramble to contain this," he murmured, glancing at his phone as another message from corporate flashed across the screen. "But it's already out." Vanessa gave a slow nod, her gaze flickering toward the galley. "And her?" Darren didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his head slightly, just enough to see the shadow of Rachel's figure beyond the curtain. The woman who had tried to erase his family's presence, now reduced to a silent silhouette, waiting for a verdict she no longer controlled. He let the silence stretch before answering. "She's already gone." At that moment, the intercom clicked once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing." Rachel flinched at the announcement, reality pressing in around her like a vice. She had entered this flight with control, with certainty. Now she sat on the edge of an abyss, waiting for the fall. In first class, Darren pulled his seatbelt across his lap, his movements slow, deliberate. He wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was the man who had just rewritten the rules of this flight. And for Rachel Simmons, the moment of reckoning wasn't coming. It had already arrived. The wheels kissed the runway with a muted thud, the familiar jolt signaling the end of the flight. But for Rachel Simmons, it was only the beginning of a far greater descent. She sat frozen in the galley, staring at her trembling hands, the soft hiss of the cabin depressurizing, filling the silence like a quiet warning. Beyond the curtain, first-class passengers stirred, stretching, collecting their belongings, their hushed whispers a constant reminder that what had happened here would not be forgotten. Rachel had spent years perfecting the art of control, of maintaining order. Now she was powerless, waiting for judgment. Darren Caldwell remained seated, his suit crisp, his presence unshaken. Vanessa adjusted Mia's coat, smoothing her daughter's curls as the little girl yawned, blissfully unaware of the storm that had raged around them. Vanessa glanced at Darren. "They'll try to apologize," Darren smirked. "They already have." He held up his phone, another message flashing across the screen. The CEO's office, the legal team, a desperate attempt at damage control. But Vanessa's gaze lingered, thoughtful. "And her?" Darren's eyes flicked toward the galley. Rachel hadn't stepped out since the announcement. She was still there, waiting for security, for the fallout, for the moment her actions caught up with her. Vanessa exhaled. "Do you think she understands now?" Darren leaned back, watching the jet bridge connect to the door. He didn't answer, because the truth was, it didn't matter. The question wasn't whether Rachel understood. It was whether the world watching would finally learn the lesson. Power isn't about status, it's about how you use it. Rachel Simmons believed she had authority, that her uniform and position gave her the right to dictate who belonged and who didn't. But true power isn't found in a title. It's found in how we treat others, especially when we think no one is watching. Darren Caldwell never raised his voice. He didn't demand respect. He commanded it through quiet confidence, through restraint, through the understanding that real influence doesn't need to be loud to be felt. He knew what Rachel did not. Every action has consequences, and every choice we make, big or small, reveals who we truly are. This wasn't just about one man and one flight attendant. it was about something bigger. How often do people in positions of authority act on bias without consequence? How many stories like this happen daily, unnoticed, unchallenged? Rachel thought she was in control, but the moment she acted unfairly, she sealed her own fate. She thought she could rewrite reality, but reality caught up with her instead. Because truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply some try to bury it. The lesson? Never underestimate the power of quiet integrity, nor the cost of unchecked prejudice. The people you look down on today may be the very ones who decide your fate tomorrow. Or perhaps they won't need to say a word at all, because sometimes the greatest reckoning isn't delivered with vengeance, it's delivered with patience. And when it comes, it speaks louder than any voice ever could. If you love this powerful story of justice at 30,000 feet, there's so much more waiting for you. At X Daily Stories, we bring you gripping tales of power shifts, unexpected twists, and life-changing lessons. Stories that make you think long after the credits roll. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. We're dropping fresh, cinematic stories every week, filled with drama, suspense, and moments that will leave you speechless. Join the conversation in the comments and share your thoughts. Follow us on X for exclusive updates, behind-the-scenes content, and more thought-provoking stories. X Daily Stories, where every story has a twist you won't see coming. Subscribe now.